Episode titled Mysterious Plant. It was a normal morning in the Pig family house. Mummy Pig made breakfast, Daddy Pig read the newspaper, Peppa was drawing, and George played with his dinosaur near the window. In the garden, he saw a strange pot with a small green sprout. The sprout moved slightly even though there was no wind. George walked closer, and the sprout leaned toward him. He brought the pot inside. Peppa asked where it came from, and Mummy Pig put it on the windowsill. At first, nothing happened, but after a few minutes the sprout grew taller. Within an hour, it reached the window edge, and its leaves slowly turned toward George. Peppa felt uneasy. It seems like it's looking at George. George watched the plant. It seemed to breathe. By evening, the stem almost reached the ceiling. Leaves covered the window. Mummy Pig tried to move the pot to the garden, but it didn't budge. Its roots seemed attached to the floor. At night, George couldn't sleep. He heard a faint rustling from below. Peppa woke. "George, do you hear that?" In the hallway, a long green stem stretched from the living room toward their room, leaves moving slowly. A small leaf slipped under the door and turned toward George, ignoring Peppa. Parents came and opened the door. The stem had vanished. Only a green trail remained on the floor. In the morning, the plant was huge, taking up the living room, leaves covering windows, stems wrapping the table and sofa. In the center was a bud, slowly opening and closing, as if watching the house. George approached the bud and heard a quiet voice. "George!" Peppa was frightened. The stem pointed toward the garden door. Everyone opened it, and the plant moved outside, stretching higher than the roof. Inside the bud, a new sprout appeared in a tiny pot. By evening, the large plant disappeared, leaving only a hole in the garden. But at night, George woke again. The small pot on the windowsill glowed, and a single leaf slowly reached toward his bed. Episode titled George's Weird Food. It was a normal morning in the Pig family house. Mummy Pig was making breakfast, Daddy Pig was reading the newspaper, and Peppa was playing nearby. George sat at the table with a bowl of porridge. But that day, something was different. George looked at his porridge, sniffed it, and made a strange face. He did not pick up the spoon. He did not eat. Mummy Pig was surprised. "George, why aren't you eating?" George only looked at her with his big eyes and quietly said, "I don't want to." At first, it seemed like a simple whim, but by noon, George refused all ordinary food. Fruits, bread, milk, everything was untouched. Peppa tried to give him an apple, and he just pushed her hand away. In the evening, George began acting strangely. He approached the table and suddenly grabbed a pen Daddy Pig had left. He put it in his mouth and started chewing. Mummy Pig shouted, "George, what are you doing?" But he didn't stop. He grabbed a spoon, then a napkin, then a pot lid. He chewed everything as if normal food had lost its taste. George did not understand what was happening. Something inside him demanded strange objects, and he could not explain it. Mummy and Daddy Pig tried to stop him, but George struggled. His eyes glimmered with a strange light. The room filled with noise, creaking, scraping, the patter of little feet. Peppa cried and tried to calm him, but he ignored her. At one point, George opened the cupboard and began chewing paper and toy boxes. He felt no pain, didn't notice the hardness of objects. He simply satisfied this unknown hunger. Mummy Pig and Daddy Pig were horrified and tried to hold him back, but George was faster and stronger than they expected. At night, George fell asleep among torn toys and scraps of paper. But at midnight, he woke up. His eyes shone strangely. He got up and quietly walked around the house, chewing paint from pencils, pieces of fabric, and tiny toy parts. The house was silent, but eerie. Floorboards creaked, paper rustled, and the atmosphere was frightening. In the morning, everything seemed normal. George sat at the table again, but his gaze was different. He no longer looked at porridge. He looked at the table as if new objects appeared around him to eat. Mummy Pig and Daddy Pig tried to distract him with games and conversation, but George reached for small things around the house again. Peppa feared this would never end. She watched her brother carefully, who methodically and decisively tasted everything in reach, feeling a quiet anxiety. George's strange hunger remained, and no one could explain it. Everyone could only observe as an ordinary day quietly turned into a strange and unsettling experience. Episode titled George's New Hands. Everything in the Pig family house started out like any other day. Mummy Pig was cooking breakfast, Daddy Pig was reading the newspaper, and Peppa and George were playing in the living room. Everything was calm, but that day George started to feel a strange pain in his shoulders. He tried to continue playing, but the pain was growing stronger. He quietly complained to Peppa, and she told him to go to Mummy Pig. When George walked over to Mummy Pig, she looked at him with concern. "What's wrong, George?" she asked. "You don't look well." "My shoulders hurt, Mummy," George replied. "I feel something strange." Mummy Pig looked at his shoulders but saw nothing unusual. She suggested he rest, but soon George realized that something even stranger was happening to his body. Later that same day, as he played with his dinosaur, he felt something begin to grow on his arms. It started with a small pain, and then his skin seemed to move as though something was under it. At first, George thought it was some kind of strange dream, but when he touched his arms, he realized it was real. Soon, new small limbs began to grow on his arms. It started with fingers, and then full little arms that began to move as if they were alive. George was frightened. He quickly hid his arms behind his back and ran to Daddy Pig. "Daddy, what's happening?" he asked, desperately trying to conceal his new arms. Daddy Pig turned around, noticing his distress. "What's going on, George? What are you hiding?" When George showed him his new arms, Daddy Pig froze in place. He was silent for a moment before saying, This is strange. You shouldn't be changing like this." George didn't know what to do. He tried to control the new arms, but they moved on their own, as if they had a mind of their own. He tried to talk to them like his other body parts, but they wouldn't listen. And that's when George realized that these arms weren't just changing his body, they were beginning to make their own decisions. Mummy Pig heard their conversation and came to the kitchen. When she saw George's new arms, her face turned pale. "George, you need to lie down," she said. "We need to figure this out immediately." But George already knew that this wasn't just an illness or a temporary condition. He realized that his body was changing, but he didn't know what would happen next. That evening, as Peppa and George were getting ready to sleep, George's new arms began to move in the dark. He felt them reaching out toward the walls, as if trying to grab something or learn something. George knew something more was going on with these arms, and it made him anxious. That night, George woke up to find that his new arms were no longer just arms. They had become something more. They began grabbing things around the room, moving on their own. He tried to stop them, but they were too strong and persistent. George couldn't hold back his fear any longer and decided that he needed to tell Peppa about what was happening. When Peppa saw what was happening to George, she was also scared. Together, they decided they needed to find a way to stop it. But was it even possible? And what if this was just the beginning of something worse? Episode titled Lost Toy. It was a normal morning in the Pig family house. Mummy Pig was making breakfast, Daddy Pig was reading the newspaper, and Peppa and George were playing. George was engrossed in his favorite toy, the dinosaur. However, this day was different. George realized that he had lost one of his old toys, a toy that had been with him before the dinosaur. It was a small plush bear. He decided he must find it. Peppa was busy and Mummy Pig was cooking. George thought it would be best to check the basement, a place he had never ventured into alone. He didn't know why, but the basement always seemed mysterious, something hidden from his sight. He approached the basement door, which was usually locked. To his surprise, it was slightly ajar. George peeked inside. A dark corridor with a few steps leading down. It was eerily quiet. He took a deep breath, held his dinosaur tightly, and went down. The steps were cold, and the air was damp. When George reached the bottom, he looked around. The basement was filled with old boxes, and in the corner there was a wardrobe, but nothing seemed unusual. He walked further, but then something caught his attention. A corner of a box was sticking out. He moved it aside and found the very toy, the small bear. George picked it up happily, but as he did, something shifted. The air grew heavy. The sound in the basement faded away. He felt the space around him begin to tighten. George didn't understand what was happening, but it felt strange and unsettling. He turned to head back up, but the stairs were gone. He tried to walk toward another wall, but it seemed farther away. The basement was growing bigger, and there was no way out. With every step, George felt the space around him changing. The walls expanded and contracted as if he were trapped. George tried calling out, "Mummy! Daddy!" but his voice was muffled and didn't reach the stairs. That's when he realized it wasn't just that he was stuck. He had entered another space. He looked at the bear. It wasn't just a toy. He noticed that its eyes had started to move slightly. This was impossible. It was a toy, but it was moving. George began to feel like his body wasn't responding. He tried walking toward the exit, but his steps grew slower and slower, as if time was stretching endlessly. The basement grew darker. Suddenly, he heard footsteps. They weren't his. Something was moving behind him. He turned around, but no one was there. He realized that there was something alive in this basement. Something was watching him, and the bear seemed to know what was happening. George gripped it tightly, but it stayed silent. After some time, George felt the basement starting to vanish. The space began returning to its original form. He found himself back at the stairs. But this basement was different. It was as it should have been. When George climbed back upstairs, everything was normal. Peppa was playing. Mummy Pig was preparing dinner. Everything seemed fine, but George felt that the basement was still somewhere in his memory. He looked at the bear. It was covered in dust, and its eyes were closed. Episode titled George's Clones. It was a normal morning. Everything in the Pig family house was calm. Mummy Pig was cooking breakfast in the kitchen. Daddy Pig was sitting at the table reading a newspaper. Peppa came downstairs and said hello. George was playing on the floor with his dinosaur. Everything looked the same as always. After breakfast, George went outside. He walked along the path quietly saying, "Dinosaur." He reached the forest and walked inside. The forest was quiet. The trees were still. George walked further until he stopped. In front of him stood someone. It was him. Another George. He held the same dinosaur. They looked at each other. The other George did not move. Then he stepped forward. George did not step back. Then the other one quietly said, "Dinosaur." George nodded. In the next moment, he disappeared. George was alone again. During the day, the family went to the mountains. George walked along a path and looked down. Suddenly, he saw movement. Below him stood another George. He looked straight. Then he started moving upward. George stepped back, but the figure stopped and disappeared. In the evening, they returned home. George sat and played, but sometimes he looked toward the door, as if waiting. At night, George woke up. The house was quiet. He heard a creak. He got up and walked downstairs. The basement door was slightly open. George went down. It was dark. He held his dinosaur. In the corner, there was someone. Another George. He was not moving. Then he raised his hand. George did the same. Then the other stepped closer. George stayed still. Then he heard a step behind him. He turned around. There was another one. George was standing between them. He did not move. They did not move either. Then all of them said, "Dinosaur," at the same time. In the morning, everything looked normal. George was sitting on the floor playing. Peppa sat next to him. She looked at him. He smiled. Peppa looked at the floor. There were 3 identical dinosaurs. Then she looked at the window. In the reflection, there was another George standing behind them.